The fox was sitting in the middle of the road when Aldous Crane opened his front door, and the way it looked at him made him take a step back. Not because it was close, it was 30 feet away, at the edge where his gravel driveway met the county road, sitting perfectly still in the gray morning light, its amber eyes fixed on him with an attention that felt less like an animal noticing movement, and more like something that had been waiting, specifically, for him. Aldous had lived on this property for 41 years. He had seen foxes before. They bolted the moment a door moved. They disappeared into the field grass like they were made of smoke. They did not sit in the road at 7 in the morning and stare at a man like they were expecting him to understand something. He stood in the doorway in his wool socks and his old flannel shirt, holding his mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm while he read the weather report, and he stared back. The fox did not move. Aldous told himself it was rabies. That was the rational answer. Animals that did not fear people were animals with something wrong in their brains, and he had lived long enough in rural Tennessee to know that a fox in the road in the morning was not a sign of anything except possible neurological disease. He told himself this clearly, in the exact words a sensible man would use, while the fox held his gaze across 30 feet of damp gravel, and did not blink, and did not flinch when the wind pushed through the sycamore at the corner of the fence and rattled its branches hard. Then the fox stood up, turned, and began walking south. It walked maybe 15 feet and stopped, turned its head back toward Aldous. Looked at him. Aldous took a slow sip of his cold coffee and said nothing. The fox turned south again and walked further, then stopped, turned its head back. He had seen that behavior before, once, in a documentary about wolves. The researchers had called it an invitation behavior. He had watched it on the old television in his study, on the same sofa where Marion used to fall asleep with her reading glasses still on her nose, and he had thought at the time that it was remarkable. He had not thought it would ever be a thing he witnessed himself, on his own road, on an October morning with a line of dark clouds moving in from the northwest and the temperature dropping with a speed the weather radio had described as significant. He set down his mug on the porch rail. He told himself he was going to check the fence line. He had been meaning to do that all week, and the south fence was exactly the direction the fox was walking. So he would simply go check the fence, and the fox would go wherever foxes went, and that would be the end of it. He went inside and pulled on his boots and his heavy canvas jacket and came back out, and the fox was still there, 60 feet down the road now, sitting again, watching the doorway. When Aldous stepped off the porch, the fox stood up and began walking. He had started, at some point in the past 3 years, to distrust impulse. Not instinct entirely, but the kind of impulse that presented itself as meaningful, as a nudge towards something, because he had learned, or believed he had learned, that the human mind was designed to find pattern and meaning in randomness, that this was in fact its primary mode of operation, and that most of what felt like a sign was simply a coincidence, noticed by a brain that was always looking for signs, because looking for signs was a very old human survival behavior that had been repurposed in the modern age, primarily for He had built this understanding carefully in the quiet of the past 3 years. He had been, he thought, thorough about it, and yet he was walking down the county road in his canvas jacket at 7 in the morning following a fox. What happened over the next 23 minutes would take Aldous the rest of his life to explain. And there were different versions of it depending on who was asking and how much he trusted them, but the core of it never changed. The fox walked south. It stopped when he lagged behind. It turned its head back every 30 feet or so, exactly as he had seen in that documentary, exactly as a dog might do when it wanted you to follow. It moved at a pace that a 71-year-old man with a replaced left knee could match without difficulty, and when it reached the fork where the county road curved west toward town and the old gravel track continued south toward the hollow where the chapel sat, it took the gravel track without hesitating. Aldous stopped at the fork. He had not been on that track in 3 years, 2 months. And some number of days he had stopped counting because counting had started to feel like a form of punishment. He stood there for a moment and looked down the track and noticed the things he always noticed when he let himself think about it. The way the cedars on either side had grown a little taller since the last time. The way the track itself had started to grass over down the center where tires no longer pressed it flat. There was a quality of disuse to it that he was responsible for and that he had never fully made peace with. He told himself, in the early months, that stepping away was the honest thing to do. That a man who no longer believed had no business standing at a pulpit. He told himself that he was protecting the congregation from something false, which was the version of himself that would have gone through the motions out of habit or duty or the inability to imagine being anything other than what he had always been. He had been careful, in those early months, to construct this reasoning with some precision, because a man who had spent 34 years helping other people find solid ground knows the difference between a foundation and a house of cards. And he needed, at least, to be standing on something. What he had not anticipated was how complete the silence would be. Not the silence of peace. The silence of a room where someone is no longer. The fox stopped, turned, looked at him. Beyond the track, invisible from where he stood, was the chapel where he had preached for 34 years, where he had married people and buried people and baptized their children, and sat with them through the worst nights of their lives, where Marian had put flowers on the altar every Sunday and kept a box of candles in the vestibule for any storm that might come, because her belief was that a church with a light in its window was a church that was doing its job, where the elders had told him 3 years ago that they understood if he needed time, and where he had not returned, not once, because the understanding he had found in those 3 years was not the kind that brought him back to anything. The sky to the northwest had gone the color of a bruise. The fox took 2 steps toward him, stopped, and looked at him with those amber eyes. And Aldous Crane, who had stopped believing in signs the morning his wife's breathing changed, and then stopped, felt something move through him that he could not name and did not try to. He turned onto the gravel track and followed the fox toward the chapel. What he would find there was not what he expected. What he would find there would undo 3 years of careful, cultivated silence in the space of about 4 minutes. And the thing that would undo him most completely was something so small, so specific, and so impossible to explain as coincidence, that he would sit down on the chapel floor and cover his face with his hands and stay that way for a long time. But that was still 20 minutes away. First, there was the matter of how he had arrived at this particular morning, at this particular road, alone. Aldous Crane had been ordained in a small ceremony at a seminary in Nashville that his mother had driven 4 hours to attend. She had brought a fruitcake wrapped in cloth, and a card that said she was proud of him in handwriting, that took up the entire inside of the card. Every inch of it, because she had a lot to say. He had been a serious young man, compact and deliberate in everything he did. The kind of student who finished his reading 2 days ahead of the syllabus and kept his notes in a system so organized that other students sometimes asked to borrow them. But the seriousness was not coldness. People who met him once tended to remember him, not for anything dramatic he said or did, but for the quality of his attention. He had a way of listening that made people feel, sometimes for the first time, like what they were saying mattered. He had taken the appointment at the chapel in Harlan's Hollow because nobody else wanted it. It was a small congregation, mostly farming families, an hour from anything that could be called a city, in a county that still had more unpaved roads than paved ones. The senior pastor at the seminary had pulled him aside before graduation and told him, with the particular gentleness of a man delivering an honest disappointment, that Harlan's Hollow was not exactly what most graduates had in mind, and that there were larger congregations in growing suburbs where a young man with Aldous's steadiness and presence could build something considerable. Aldous had thanked him and taken the Hollow anyway, because it had seemed to him that building something considerable was not, in the end, the most important use of a life. The families were real, and their troubles were real, and Aldous found that he was good at the part of the work that no seminary class had adequately prepared him for, which was simply being present when there was nothing to say. He had met Marian Foss at a potluck dinner 3 months after arriving. She had brought a sweet potato casserole with a crust of toasted pecans and had argued with him, quietly, and without apparent self-consciousness, about the interpretation of a passage in the book of Job that he had cited in his sermon that morning. She was not a member of his congregation. She had come with her cousin, she had not been particularly religious, she told him later, but she had strong opinions about Job, specifically because Job's problem was one she recognized, the idea that suffering required an explanation, that there had to be a reason, that a good God and an unexplained catastrophe could not occupy the same universe. "I don't think they can be reconciled," she told him, on their third conversation about this, which happened 6 weeks after the potluck, over coffee in the only diner in town that was open past 4 in the afternoon. I think that's the whole point of the book. That they can't, that you just have to sit with both things being true. He had not agreed with her at the time. He had believed, with the confidence of a young man who had not yet lost anything he could not recover from, that suffering and grace occupied the same space, and were, in fact, often the same thing, that the darkness was not absence, but a kind of terrain. He had believed this when he married her 2 years later in the chapel where he preached, with her 3 sisters and his mother watching and the sycamore outside throwing its first yellow leaves against the window. He had believed it for 31 years of marriage, through 2 miscarriages and a diagnosis. That turned out to be nothing, and a truck that had slid off the icy road and put Marianne in the hospital for 8 days with 3 broken ribs and a punctured lung. And through the slow financial unraveling of the farming families, he served as crops failed and equipment broke and children moved away to cities that could pay them. He had believed it until the morning 3 years ago when the cancer that the doctors had been managing for 14 months stopped responding to the treatment, and Marian had taken his hand in the hospital room and said, "This is not the ending I would have written." And then, very quietly and without drama, as if she were simply stepping into the next room, she had gone. He had sat with her for 2 hours after. He had not prayed. He had not prayed since. The elders of the chapel had been patient, and then they had been very patient. And then they had found a younger pastor, a man from Cookville, with a family and a guitar and a genuinely warm way with people. And Aldous had told them that was right. That was the right thing, and he had meant it. He had not gone back to see how it was going. He had not driven past. He had taken the long way into town for 3 years, the way that added 11 minutes to a trip he did not much enjoy making anyway, because the short way went past the chapel and he did not want to see the light in the windows from the road at night and feel whatever it was he would feel. The gravel track curved south through a stand of cedars, and then the cedars opened and he could see the chapel. He had built most of it himself, with the congregation, in the summer of his 2nd year. The original structure had been a converted equipment shed, barely large enough for the families who came, with a roof that leaked over the left side of the pews every time it rained. They had built the new chapel from timber cut on the ridge above the property, and the men had come on Saturdays through June and July, and the women had brought food, and the children had chased each other through the sawdust, and by August, they had a building that said 80 people and had a proper vestibule and a clear window over the altar that caught the morning light in a way that Aldous had never been entirely sure was an accident of geometry or something else. The fox was sitting at the base of the front steps. Aldous stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at it. The chapel door was closed. The sign out front, the one Aldous had made himself from a piece of white oak, still had the name on it, Harlan's Hollow Community Chapel. The new pastor had not changed it, which Aldous had not expected and which had moved him, quietly, when he heard about it. The fox looked at him, then it looked at the door, then it looked at him again, and then Aldous heard it. It was faint, fainter than the wind in the cedars behind him, fainter than the first distant percussion of thunder that came rolling down from the northwest, so faint that he was not entirely sure he had heard it at all, and not simply imagined it, because he was an old man, alone in a clearing, with a strange fox on a dark morning. But he stood very still and let the wind settle for a moment, and he heard it again, a sound from inside the chapel, small and irregular, not the sound of an animal, not the settling of old timber, not the kind of sound a building makes when it is cold or when a window has worked itself loose in the frame, the sound of a child. He would remember later that his first thought was not alarm but something else, something closer to recognition. Though he could not have said what he was recognizing or why, he would remember that he had felt, in the 2 or 3 seconds before his body began moving, something that he had not felt in a very long time, which was that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. His body moved before his mind did, which was something he had read about. The way the brain processes certain kinds of sound before consciousness catches up, and he was at the bottom of the steps before he had decided to walk there. The fox moved aside, without hurry, the way a cat might shift when you come through a door it has been sitting against, and Aldous pushed the door open. The vestibule was dim. The inner door to the sanctuary was ajar, and through the gap he could see the shape of the pews in the gray morning light, and the altar at the far end. And on the altar, small and specific and absolutely real, the flame of a single candle. He pushed the inner door open and stepped inside. The girl was in the third pew from the front, on the left side, curled against the pew back, with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them and her head down. She was wearing a purple rain jacket that was darkly wet across the shoulders, and her sneakers were soaked through, and her hair was plastered to the side of her face. She was shaking. She lifted her head when the door opened and looked at him with enormous dark eyes, and the sound she had been making, the small, irregular sound, resolved itself into something he recognized. She had been humming to herself, the way children sometimes hum when they are trying not to be afraid. She looked at him, he looked at her. Outside, the thunder came again, closer, and the first hard drops of rain hit the clear window over the altar and ran down the glass in crooked lines. He said, quietly, "Are you all right?" She shook her head. He walked up the center aisle, slow and deliberate, the way he had walked it 1,000 times, and he sat down in the pew across from her, not too close, and he looked at her and said, "Well, tell me what happened." She was 9 years old. Her name was Polly. She had been staying with her grandmother, whose house was on the Caldwell Road, about 2 miles east of the chapel, and she had come outside that morning before her grandmother woke up to look for a cat, which had gotten out the night before. And she had gotten turned around in the cedar woods when the sky went dark, and she had not been able to find her way back, and she had walked the wrong direction for a long time, before she saw the chapel through the trees. The door was unlocked, she told him. "I didn't think that was wrong." She paused. "I didn't know if anyone came here anymore." He told her it was not wrong. He told her she had done exactly right. She looked at the candle on the altar and said, "I found it in a box in the little room by the door. There was a whole box of them. I lit it because the window was dirty, and I thought if someone was looking for me, they might see the light." She looked back at him. Was Tat okay? There was a box of candles in the vestibule. There had always been a box of candles in the vestibule. Marian had put them there in the first year they had the chapel, and had replaced them every time they ran low, because her belief, her settled and unargued conviction, was that a church in a storm needed a light in its window, so that anyone lost could find their way. It was not a policy he had instituted. It was not something the elders had discussed. It had been one woman's specific, practical act of faith, maintained over 30 years, and when Marian died, the candles had still been there. In the same wooden box she had always kept them in the vestibule of a chapel Aldous had not entered since. The girl had found the box. She had lit a candle. She had put it in the window, in the way she thought you should, when you were lost and afraid and hoping that someone might see. She had not known Marian. She had never been in this chapel before. She had not known there was any significance to the candle or the box or the window. She had simply done the thing that seemed right to do. And the thing that seemed right was the thing Marian had done every storm for 30 years, was the thing Marian had told him once, sitting in the pew on the left side, the same pew this child now occupied, that she believed the church was for. Aldous sat in the pew across from this child he did not know in the chapel he had abandoned, and he felt something break open in him in a way that was not like pain, or was like pain but also like the relief that sometimes comes after pain when a fever finally breaks, or a wound is finally cleaned, and you understand that the worst of it is over. He did not say any of this. He said, "There is a phone at the back of the vestibule on the wall. We are going to call your grandmother, and then we are going to stay here until the storm passes, and we are going to be just fine." Polly looked at him for a moment, still shaking but studying him with the frank and serious gaze of a child who is deciding whether to trust someone, which is a kind of assessment that children perform more accurately than adults generally give them credit for. She said, "Okay, Tensei Sade, are you the pastor here?" Aldous looked at the altar, at the candele, at the window above it, where the rain was coming down now in earnest, in the grey and heavy sheets that a storm like this one brought before the real wind arrived. He said, "I used to be." She considered this. She said, "It's a nice church. It feels like someone took care of it." He said, "They did." He called the grandmother from the old wall phone that still worked. Somehow, though he had expected it not to, the grandmother, whose name was Betty, cried when she heard his voice identify himself, and then her granddaughter's. She said she had been searching for an hour and had not known where to look, and she was coming right now, and thank God. He told her to drive slow. The rain was getting heavy, and he would have the girl warm and safe when she arrived. He hung up the phone and stood for a moment in the vestibule with his hand still on the receiver, looking at the wooden box on the shelf where it had always been. The candles inside were the same kind Marian had always bought, the simple beeswax ones from the hardware store in town. Unscented, practical. Most of the box was still full. Someone had been replacing them. He went back into the sanctuary and sat with Polly, and they listened to the storm move through, and she told him about her cat, whose name was Breadcrumb because of the way it followed her around the house, and he told her about the way the chapel had been built, which she found interesting in the way that children sometimes find the fact of old things being made by hand interesting, as though it reveals something about the world they had not previously considered. When Betty arrived 40 minutes later, pulling her car up to the chapel steps in the driving rain, she came through the door and wrapped her granddaughter in her arms and held her the way grandmothers hold lost children, which is with a completeness that has no words in it. Then she looked at Aldous and said, "Reverend Crane, of all people." He said he was glad to be here, and he meant it. He noticed that he meant it. The way you notice a sensation returning to a limb you thought was numb, not all at once, not without uncertainty, but real. Betty looked at the candle on the altar, still burning, and she said, "She lit that herself, did she?" "Polly," he said she had. Betty was quiet for a moment. Tense aside, Marian used to do that. Every single storm, for as long as I can remember. He said, "I know." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Betty was a woman of a certain kind that exists more in small communities than in large ones. A woman who is weathered enough that silence does not frighten her and who knows when words would only diminish what is already being said clearly enough without them. She looked at the candle. Then she looked at Aldous. Then she looked at her granddaughter, who was shivering still, but had started to relax, the way children relaxed when the adults around them have stopped being afraid. Polly said, from inside her grandmother's arms, "Is this where you live?" Aldous said, "Not exactly, but it's somewhere I belong, I think." Polly considered this answer with the gravity of a 9-year-old who has been genuinely frightened and is now in the relief that follows, which creates a particular kind of openness. She said, "It felt safe. Even before you came, the building felt like it was supposed to have people in it." He did not say anything to that. There was nothing to say to it that would make it more true than it already was. Outside, the storm was moving east now, the worst of it through, the rain gentling from its driven sheets into something softer. The light through the clear window over the altar had changed from the flat gray of the storm to something with color in it, the particular quality of light that comes after heavy rain when the clouds begin to thin and the sun, still low, finds its way through in long and specific ways. It fell across the altar, across the candle, across the wooden box in the vestibule that someone had kept filled. Aldous would later learn that the woman who'd been replacing the candles was an elder named Bev Hartwell, who had been a member of the congregation for 20 years, and who had made it her practice to come to the chapel every few weeks to make sure things were in order, and who had simply continued to replace the candles in Marian's box because she had seen Marian do it for so many years, and it had seemed like the right thing to continue. She had not announced it, she had not told anyone. She had simply done it because someone had always done it, and it seemed important that someone still should. He drove out to visit Bev, The following week, they sat at her kitchen table with coffee, and she told him about how the congregation was doing. And he told her about Polly, which she had already heard about because this was a small community and word moved fast. And she said she thought it was a miracle, and he did not say what he thought about miracles, but he did not argue with her either. He asked if she needed any help with anything at the chapel. She looked at him for a moment across her kitchen table with the directness of a woman who has learned to take things at face value because she does not have time for the alternative. She said, "We have a small group that meets Thursday evenings. It's informal. We read a passage and talk about it. Nobody preaches, but someone leads the discussion, and the person who was leading just moved to Knoxville to be near her daughter." She paused. "It's only about 12 people, mostly older. The young pastor comes on Sundays, but Thursday nights he can't always make it." Aldous held his coffee cup with both hands. He said, "Thursday evenings?" She said, 7 o'clock. If he wanted to come not to preach, just to be there, he came the following Thursday. He sat in the same pew he had sat in when he found Polly, which he had not planned. 12 people were there. Some he knew from years before. Some whose names he had There was a man named Crawford who had lost his farm and was working at the grain elevator now, and who Aldous remembered as a proud man in the way that farming men are sometimes proud. Not arrogantly, but fundamentally, because the land and the work and the ability to provide had been identical to his sense of himself. Crawford had aged in the 3 years since Aldous had seen him. Aldous had to, he assumed, because time worked that way regardless of whether you were paying attention. He did not preach. He led a conversation about a passage from the Psalms, one of the harder ones, the ones that deal with abandonment and silence, and the long wait for something that may not come. He had opinions about that passage that he had not had before, or had had but had not said. He said some of them. Crawford said something back that surprised him, something raw and unpolished and entirely true in the way that only things said by people who have stopped performing can be true. An older woman named Celeste, who had been in the congregation since before Aldous arrived, and who had buried a husband and a son in the years since, said something quieter, and the room held it for a moment without rushing past it. The people talked. Listen it. At the end he said almost nothing, only asked one question that seemed to open something in the room rather than close it, the way a good question does. Bev Hartwell walked him out to his truck afterward and said, "Same time next week." He said, "Same time next week." That was how it began. Not with a sermon, not with a decision, not with a prayer he believed in yet. With a conversation on a Thursday night in October, and 12 people in an old chapel that still smelled like the timber that had built it, and a question that opened something instead of closing it. What had brought him there was a fox, and a gravel track, and an October morning with a storm coming in from the northwest. What had kept him walking was a behavior he recognized from a documentary he had watched on his old sofa on the evening after Marion's funeral, when he had not been able to sleep and had turned on the television without much expectation and had sat there in the dark watching wolves on a screen, thinking about invitation and what it means to be asked to follow. He never saw the fox again. He looked, in the months that followed, every time he made the drive down the gravel track to the chapel. The farmers in the area had not seen a fox in that part of the hollow in years. As it turned out, one man, whose land abutted the chapel property, said he had seen a red fox once, back in the spring, but it had been skittish, as foxes usually are. Nothing like what Aldous described. Aldous described it only once, to Bev Hart, and Bev listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then sat for a moment in silence, and then said, "I don't know what to make of that. I really don't." He said, "Neither do I," she said. "But you followed it," he said. "I followed it." She considered this. She said, "Maybe that's the whole story right there." He was not sure she was wrong. There is something worth saying about the candle, which Polly had placed on the altar in the way that seemed right to her, which was not the vestibule window where Marion had always put them, but the altar, where the morning light would catch it through the clear glass above. He had noticed this, that the placement was different. He had almost said something about it, about where the candles were supposed to go, and then he had stopped himself, because Who was he to say where a 9-year-old girl's candle was supposed to go in a church she had found alone in a storm? He had left it there when they went home. He had gone back the following afternoon, before the Thursday evening discussion, to open the chapel and edit out, and the candle had burned itself out overnight, leaving a small pool of hardened wax on the altar cloth. He cleaned it off carefully, the way you clean something that has earned its stain, and he put the altar cloth back smooth. And he stood at the altar for a moment in the afternoon light, coming through the clear window. He was not sure what he believed. He was not sure he would ever be as sure as he had been at 26, in the full confidence of a young man who has not yet lost what matters most. He thought about this sometimes on the drive to the chapel, which he now made on Thursdays, and sometimes on other days too. When the weather was good, and he wanted to walk the property, he thought that certainty might have been, in some ways, the easier thing to carry. That a man who believed with completeness had a kind of ballast that a man who believed partially and uncertainly, and with full knowledge of why his belief was incomplete, did not have. But he also thought that Marian, who had never been certain, who had argued about Job in a diner at 32 and had not resolved the argument by the time she died, had been more faithful in her own way than many people he had known who were very certain of everything. Her faith had not required the questions to go away. It had lived alongside the questions. It had, in fact, been partly made of them. He thought of Marian, saying that suffering and grace could not be reconciled. That Job's point was exactly that. Both were real, and that sitting with both being true was the actual work. He thought she had been right, and he thought he had not understood it until now, at 71, in the chapel they had built together, in a silence that was not empty. He thought of a fox that did not behave like foxes behave, on a road in October, on a morning when the storm was coming. He thought of a child who had never met Marian Foss, placing a candle exactly where Marian Fossey had always believed a candle should be. Not in the window. On the altar, which was different, and also, in a way he could not prove and would not argue, the same. He turned off the lights and locked the door and walked back to his truck in the late afternoon sun. And for the first time in 3 years, 2 months, and a number of days, he had finally stopped counting. He did not take the long way home. The candle on the altar had burned all the way down. The wax it left behind was still warm.